Part 1, Christmas Day, 1941. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A PB Catalina flying boat, unmarked, drops down through the low sun of the Pacific and settles onto the water inside the harbor. The propellers wind down. The hatch opens. A man in a khaki service uniform steps out onto the pontoon. He is 56 years old, 5'8", blue eyes, hair the color of iron, no ribbons on his chest, no fanfare, no band, no press. His name is Chester W. Nimitz. He is the new Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. He looks up. He does not speak. Because 18 days earlier, at 8 minutes to 8 in the morning on the 7th of December, 353 Japanese aircraft came in over these mountains and destroyed everything in front of him. 2,403 Americans were killed. 1,178 were wounded. Battleship USS Arizona sits on the bottom of the harbor with 1,100 of her crew still trapped inside her. She is smoldering. USS Oklahoma is upside down. The USS Utah is upside down. The USS California, the USS West Virginia, the USS Nevada, the USS Pennsylvania damaged, holed, sunk, or aground. Oil floats on the surface of Pearl Harbor, 8 inches thick. In the oil, floating and drifting, are the bodies of men that no one has been able to reach. Chester Nimitz steps off the pontoon onto the pier. He carries a small canvas suitcase. His aide walks behind him. He does not go to a battleship, because there are no battleships. He does not go to Pacific Fleet headquarters aboard the flagship, because the flagship is in dry dock with holes in her side. He walks down the pier to the submarine base. A car is waiting. Driver salutes. The car takes him to the office of the Commander-in-Chief of the Submarine Force, Pacific, and there Chester Nimitz sits down at a borrowed desk, in a borrowed office, in a borrowed chair, and begins to read. He reads the casualty reports. He reads the ship damage reports. He reads the intelligence summaries. He reads until midnight. Then he closes the folders, walks down to the submarine base pier, and looks out across the black water of Pearl Harbor at the wreck of the United States Pacific Fleet. Somewhere beneath his feet, in the sealed compartments of the USS Arizona, men are still calling out. Divers have heard them hammering on the hull over the next few weeks. Some of the hammering continues into January, some into February. The last known sound stopped in late December. No one on the surface could reach them. Chester Nimitz stands alone on the pier. He is 56 years old. He is the grandson of a German immigrant. He is a submarine man. He is a Lutheran. He is quiet. He speaks softly. He never raises his voice. The President of the United States has jumped him over 28 admirals to give him this command. Men senior to him do not want him here. Washington does not entirely want him here either. But Franklin Roosevelt looked at him across a desk in the White House 6 days earlier and said, "You will command the Pacific Fleet. You will be there tomorrow." So he is here to understand what he is about to do and why Washington will not want him to do any of it. You have to go back to a small town in the Texas Hill Country, to the summer of 1885, to the boy who was not supposed to be here. He was born on the 24th of February, 1885, in Fredericksburg, Texas, above a hotel called the Steamboat Hotel, which his grandfather ran on the main street of a small German-American town in the middle of nowhere. His grandfather was named Charles Henry Nimitz. Charles Henry had come across the ocean from Bremen in 1846 when he was 19 years old. He was a merchant seaman. He had opened a tavern in Fredericksburg because there was a shortage of good beer in the Texas Hill Country, and Charles Henry knew how to brew it. He was still alive when Chester was born. Chester's father, Chester Bernhard Nimitz, was not. His father had died of rheumatic fever 6 months before Chester was born, so the boy grew up above the tavern. His mother, Anna Henke Nimitz, worked in the family hotel. She remarried when Chester was 5 to his father's brother, and they had more children. Chester did the chores. He read whatever books he could find. He spoke German at home with his grandfather. In town, he spoke English. He was quiet. He was polite. He was not remarkable. There is nothing in the story of a small blonde boy in Fredericksburg, Texas, in the 1890s that suggests he will one day sign the surrender of the Empire of Japan. He did not want to be a sailor. He wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to go to West Point. In 1901, at the age of 16, he wrote to his congressman, a man named James L. Sladen, and asked for an appointment to the United States Military Academy. Sladen wrote back with an unwelcome answer. There were no West Point appointments available. There was one Naval Academy appointment. The boy took it. He did not know one end of a ship from the other. He passed the entrance exam anyway. He was 16 years old when he arrived at Annapolis in September of 1901. 4 years later, in 1905, he graduated 7th in a class of 114, 20 years old. And then, 3 years after graduation, he almost destroyed his career. 7th of July, 1908, Batangas Bay in the Philippines. Ensign Chester W. Nimitz, 23 years old, was in temporary command of the destroyer USS Decatur. He was tired. He had been on watch for many hours. The waters of Batangas Bay had shifting shoals that were not accurately marked on the charts. He gave a wrong bearing to the helmsman. The USS Decatur ran hard aground on a mud bank. The ship was not sunk. She was not seriously damaged, but she was stuck, and a United States Navy warship stuck on a mud bank in the middle of a Philippine bay was, in the year 1908, a career-ending incident. There was a court-martial. Chester W. Nimitz was found guilty of hazarding a warship. He was 23 years old. The Navy could have dismissed him. They did not. Because Nimitz, when questioned, did not blame the helmsman. He did not blame the charts. He did not blame the darkness. He said the fault was his own, that he had given the wrong bearing, that the responsibility of command was absolute. The court punished him with a letter of reprimand. In 1909, the Navy reassigned him to submarines. Nobody wanted submarines in 1909. Submarines were dark, small, dangerous. Gasoline-fumed metal tubes that leaked oil and killed their own crews as often as they killed anyone else's. Any officer with prospects avoided them. Assignment to submarines was, in effect, a slow way out of the Navy. Nimitz did not fight the assignment. He went. He learned the engines. He learned the diesel systems. He learned to fix things with his own hands. In the dark, at 40 feet down, with the air going bad and the batteries fading, he became the Navy's expert on submarine propulsion. 33 years later, when the Japanese destroyed every battleship in the Pacific Fleet, Franklin Roosevelt would look across a room at his advisors and say, "We need a man who can fight the war we have, not the war we lost." The war they had was going to be a war of submarines and aircraft carriers, not battleships. And the only four-star material officer in the United States Navy who had spent his whole career in submarines was Chester W. Nimitz. The reprimand of 1908 had made him the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet of 1941. That is the part of his story that people forget. He was here because he had failed. Now, back to Pearl Harbor. Christmas night, 1941. 7th of December had happened 18 days earlier. Chester Nimitz had been in Washington, at his desk at the Bureau of Navigation, when the first reports came in that Sunday morning. It was 2:30 in the afternoon in Washington when the Japanese aircraft had finished their work at Pearl Harbor. He heard the news at home. His wife, Catherine Freeman Nimitz, they had married in 1913. They had been married 28 years, heard it beside him. He did not say much. He went to the Navy Department, worked through the night. On the 17th of December, 10 days after the attack, Admiral Husband Kimmel, who had been commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet on the day of the attack, was relieved of his command. Kimmel would spend the rest of his life defending his conduct at Pearl Harbor. He would die in 1968, still fighting to clear his name. On the 19th of December, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox picked up a telephone in his office and called Chester Nimitz. "Chester," he said, "come to the White House. The president wants to see you." Nimitz put on his uniform and walked over. He entered the Oval Office. Franklin Roosevelt was in his wheelchair behind the desk. Knox stood beside him. The president looked up. He said, "You will command the Pacific Fleet. You will be there tomorrow." Chester Nimitz stood in front of the President of the United States and did something almost no man does. When a president offers him a 4-star command, he said no. He said there were 28 admirals senior to him in the Navy. He said giving him this command would create resentment. He said he did not want to jump the line. Roosevelt did not argue. He said again, "You will be there tomorrow." That was the end of the conversation. Nimitz went home. He packed. His wife, Catherine, helped him. He took a train to San Diego. He boarded a PBY Catalina flying boat on Christmas Eve. Christmas Day, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he arrived at Ford Island. He looked at the wreckage. He did not speak. 6 days later, on the 31st of December, 1941, at 10 o'clock in the morning, on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling, because there was no battleship left to stand on Chester W. Nimitz read aloud the orders that made him the commander-in-chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. He kept all of Kimmel's staff, every intelligence officer, every operations officer, every planner. Washington had expected him to fire them all, to sweep the deck clean, to start fresh. He refused. He said the men here knew the Pacific. Washington did not. Down in the basement of the old administration building, near the submarine base, in a windowless room lit by fluorescent bulbs, a commander named Joseph Rochefort ran a code-breaking operation called Station Hype. Rochefort was 41 years old. He had lived in Tokyo for 3 years learning Japanese in the 1920s. He worked in a red velvet smoking jacket over his uniform because the basement was cold. He kept his feet in bedroom slippers because he was on them 20 hours a day. His team of 30 men, cryptographers, mathematicians, Japanese linguists, was decoding roughly 20% of the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational radio traffic. Nimitz kept Rochefort. Nimitz protected Rochefort. Nimitz would, 5 months later, back Rochefort against the entire Washington cryptographics establishment. And it would win the Battle of Midway. But before that, the man who had jumped over 28 senior officers, the man who had been court-martialed at 23, the man who had grown up above a tavern in Texas had to make his first decision. Christmas night, 1941, Ford Island Pier. He stood alone in the dark and looked at the ruined harbor. He did not know that in the next 45 months, he would sign the death warrants of 92,000 American servicemen. He did not know he would sign the surrender document of the Empire of Japan on the deck of the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September, 1945. He did not know he would spend the last 20 years of his life refusing to write about any of it, because he said he would have to write about people he knew. He only knew that Christmas night that his fleet was on the bottom of the harbor, and that Washington was watching, and that Washington was wrong. Part 2. By the spring of 1942, Chester Nimitz had commanded the Pacific Fleet for 5 months. The fleet was still on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. What was left, what could still float a handful of cruisers, 3 aircraft carriers, some destroyers, some submarines, was scattered across 4,000 miles of ocean, running raids, running for cover, running out of time. Japanese Navy owned the Pacific. They had taken Guam, they had taken Wake, they had taken Manila, they had taken Singapore, in what Winston Churchill would call the worst military defeat in British history. They had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off the coast of Malaya. They had bombed Darwin, Australia. They had raided Colombo in Ceylon. They had sunk the American aircraft carrier USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. Their fleet had never lost a battle. Their carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, and 2 others had led the raid on Pearl Harbor. 4 of those carriers had also crossed the Indian Ocean. They had killed British sailors from Ceylon to Sumatra without ever being touched. They were, in the spring of 1942, the most feared naval force in the world. And in April, the intercepts began to change. Down in the basement at Pearl Harbor, in the windowless room where Joseph Rochefort worked in his slippers, a code group began to appear in the Japanese naval traffic that had not appeared before. 2 letters, AF. It appeared in operational orders. It appeared in supply requests. It appeared in movement schedules. Rochefort's team, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, the mathematician, Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, the Japanese linguist, and about 28 others working in shifts around the clock could see that AF was going to be the target of the next great Japanese naval operation. They just did not know where AF was. They thought they knew. They thought AF was Midway Atoll, a small pair of islands, 1,200 nautical miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, a refueling stop, a weather station, a garrison of Marines, and a runway, and not much else. If Japan took Midway, they could threaten Hawaii itself. If Japan took Midway, the Pacific War might be lost by the end of 1942. Rochefort was almost certain. Washington was not. In Washington, in the offices of OP-20G, which was the Navy's Central Cryptographic Authority, 2 officers named Redman ran the operation. Vice Admiral Joseph R. Redman and his brother Rear Admiral John R. Redman. They were career men. They controlled Navy communications. And they did not like being told by a commander in a basement in Hawaii that the biggest intelligence coup of the war had happened in a red velvet smoking jacket and slippers on their watch. They said AF was not Midway. They said AF was probably Alaska, possibly the Panama Canal, maybe San Francisco. They said Rochefort was guessing. Chester Nimitz sat in his office at Pearl Harbor and listened to both sides. 10th of May, 1942, he made the first of his 6 decisions. He backed Rochefort. He allowed Rochefort to send a message. The message was one of the most elegant intelligence operations of the war. Rochefort ordered the Marine garrison on Midway to broadcast in the clear and plain English, unencrypted, on an ordinary radio channel, a fake report that their water distillation plant was broken, that they were running out of fresh water. The signal went out. Within 24 hours, Japanese naval traffic surged with new orders. Intercepts came in. AF is short of fresh water. Rochefort read it. He said nothing manic. He simply took the sheet at dramatic. He simply told administration paper up the stairs of the old administration building and put it on the desk of Chester Nimitz. Nimitz read it. He said, "That is Midway." The Redman brothers in Washington were furious. They said the test proved nothing. They said Rochefort had staged it. They demanded Nimitz not act on the interpretation. Nimitz ignored them. The second decision came a week later. Japan was sending 4 fleet carriers to Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, plus 2 light carriers, plus 11 battleships, plus 22 cruisers, plus 65 destroyers. More than 200 warships converging on a point 1,200 miles from Pearl Harbor, expecting to catch what remained of the American fleet with its guard down. Nimitz had 3 carriers: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. The Yorktown had been hit at the Battle of the Coral Sea on the 8th of May. She had taken a bomb and a near miss. She had limped to Pearl Harbor. The Navy Yard estimated 3 months to repair her. Nimitz walked down to the dry dock. He looked at her. He asked the yard superintendent how long. The yard superintendent said 3 months. Nimitz said, "You have 72 hours." The yard workers of Pearl Harbor, 1,400 men, working in 3 shifts around the clock, welding, cutting, patching, repaired the Yorktown in 72 hours. On the 28th of May, 1942, she sailed out of Pearl Harbor. She had bomb damage in her frames. She had leaks. She was operating on temporary bulkheads. She sailed anyway. She joined the Enterprise and the Hornet somewhere in the ocean northeast of Midway, at a rendezvous point Nimitz had named Point Luck, picked the name himself. On the 4th of June, 1942. At 10:22 in the morning, the aircraft of the United States Pacific Fleet, guided to their target by the intelligence Joseph Rochefort had produced in a basement at Pearl Harbor, found the Japanese carrier force. In 6 minutes, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers destroyed 3 Japanese fleet carriers. Kagi burned, Kaga burned, Soryu burned. That afternoon, the Yorktown Nimitz's 72-hour miracle found the Hiryu and helped destroy her. That afternoon, the Hiryu found the Yorktown. The Yorktown was hit 3 times by bombs. Then she was hit by torpedoes. Then she was hit again 3 days later, on the 7th of June, by torpedoes from Japanese submarine I-168. She rolled over. She sank. 307 Americans died. 3,057 Japanese died. The Battle of Midway was over. The Pacific War had turned. Chester Nimitz sent a message to Washington. He did not thank OP-20G. He thanked Station Hypo. He said the victory belonged to Joseph Rochefort. And that was when the third decision began, because the Redman brothers, who had been wrong about AF, could not admit that they had been wrong about AF. Joseph Rochefort had proven them wrong in public, in front of the entire United States Navy. So they went to work. Through the summer of 1942, they wrote memos. They complained about the chain of command. They said Rochefort was insubordinate. They said Station Hypo was operating outside their authority. They said the credit for Midway belonged to OP-20G in Washington, not to the basement at Pearl Harbor. And in October of 1942, 4 months after Midway, they arranged for Joseph Rochefort to be transferred out of Station Hypo. He was sent to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. His new command was designated ARD-15. It was an auxiliary repair dock, a 300-foot piece of steel that other ships tied up to when they needed repairs. It had no guns. It had no crew of 30 codebreakers. It had no radio intercept station. It had no strategic value. The best cryptographer of the Second World War was made the captain of a dry dock. He was 42 years old. Nimitz protested. Nimitz wrote to the Chief of Naval Personnel. Nimitz wrote to Admiral King. Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Navy Cross. Nimitz was overruled. The Navy Cross recommendation was denied. Transfer stood. And Rochefort, quietly, without complaint, boarded a Pan American clipper for San Francisco and took command of a dry dock. He served the rest of the war on the dry dock. He never spoke publicly about Midway. He kept the secret. Because the secret, how the code had been broken, how the intercepts had been read, how AF had been identified, was still classified. Any word from Rochefort might have alerted the Japanese that their code had been compromised, that even after the code had been changed. He kept his mouth shut. For 32 years, he kept his mouth shut until he died on the 20th of July, 1976, in Torrance, California, at the age of 76, without a Navy Cross, without recognition, without a book, without a memoir, without a single interview. We will come back to Joseph Rochefort at the end of this story, because history did come for him, eventually, just not while he was alive. Nimitz kept his protest quiet. He learned in the summer of 1942 that Washington's memory was long, and Washington's ability to punish an officer for being right was longer. He could not save Rochefort. He kept the rest of the team, Dyer, Wright, Finnegan, in place at Station Hypo. He protected what he could protect. He turned to the next problem. The problem was Guadalcanal. From August of 1942 to February of 1943, the United States Marine Corps and the United States Army fought the Empire of Japan for a swamp-covered island in the southern Solomons. 6 months, 7,100 Americans dead. 24,000 Japanese dead, most of them from starvation. Guadalcanal was a victory. Chester Nimitz sat in his office at Pearl Harbor and looked at the casualty lists and thought about what came next. Rabaul, Truk, Chichijima, Wake, Iwo Jima, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Okinawa. There were, between his fleet in the summer of 1942 and the home islands of Japan, perhaps 400 garrisoned islands and atolls. Each one held a Japanese garrison. Each one had airfields, or supply dumps, or anchorages, or fortifications. If he took every island the way he had taken Guadalcanal, 6 months of fighting, 7,000 dead, the war would not end in his lifetime. It would need 40 years. He did not have 40 years. He had, at most, another 3. So on the 17th of June, 1943, Chester Nimitz proposed to Admiral King what became known as the island hopping doctrine. Do not take every island. Take some, leave the rest. Bypass the strongest garrisons. Let them wither. Cut their supply lines with submarines. Bomb their airfields from carriers. Starve them where they sit. Truk was the great test. Truk was the largest Japanese naval base in the Central Pacific. 40,000 Japanese troops, a vast lagoon full of warships and merchant vessels. Airfields with hundreds of aircraft. Any American amphibious assault on Truk would have cost, by the Navy's own estimates, 20,000 American casualties. Nimitz did not assault Truk. On the 17th and 18th of February, 1944, the Fast Carrier Task Force under Mark Mitcher hit Truk from the air. 12 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, 2 days of continuous strikes. They sank 40 ships in the lagoon. They destroyed more than 200 Japanese aircraft. They lost 25 American aircraft. They killed perhaps 4,000 Japanese sacers and airmen, and then they sailed away. Truk was left there. The garrison of 40,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors sat on Truk for the rest of the war. They ate their own gardens. They ate the fish in the lagoon. They ate the rats. By the end of the war, they were eating each other. Nimitz never went back for them. The same thing happened at Rabaul. The same thing happened at Wake. The same thing happened at a dozen other Japanese strongpoints scattered across the Western Pacific. Historians estimate that the island-hopping doctrine, developed and championed by Chester Nimitz over the strong objection of Admiral King, saved more than 100,000 American lives. King never fully forgave him. The fifth decision was worse. Pearl Harbor Conference, the 26th and 27th of July, 1944. Franklin Roosevelt sailed to Pearl Harbor aboard the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore. It was an election year. He was running for a 4th term. He had not seen the Pacific War in person. He wanted to. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the Southwest Pacific area, flew in from Brisbane. Chester Nimitz was already there. They met at a private villa on Waikiki Beach near Diamond Head on the afternoon of the 26th of July. Question was where to go next. Admiral King, from his office in Washington, wanted to bypass the Philippines and strike directly at Formosa, the island the Chinese call Taiwan. King argued that Formosa would cut Japan's oil supply from the East Indies more efficiently than a Philippines campaign. Douglas MacArthur wanted the Philippines. He had promised in 1942, when he had escaped from Corregidor, "I shall return." He had said it in Adelaide, in Australia, on the 20th of March, 1942. He had put those 3 words on posters. He had spoken them into microphones. He had made them, by the summer of 1944, one of the most famous phrases of the Second World War. He wanted the Philippines. He wanted Leyte. He wanted Luzon. He wanted the surrender of the Empire of Japan to come with the American flag flying again over Manila. Chester Nimitz walked into that villa on Waikiki Beach on the afternoon of the 26th of July with a briefing folder that recommended Formosa. That is on the record. He agreed with King. MacArthur talked for 90 minutes. He argued for the Philippines. He argued for the Filipino guerrilla resistance, which had been holding the countryside for over 2 years, waiting. He argued for the American promise. He argued for the honor of the United States. He was theatrical. He was pompous. He was persuasive. Sometime during those 2 days at Waikiki, in a room where only 4 men were present, Roosevelt, MacArthur, Nimitz, and Admiral William Leahy Chester Nimitz changed his mind. He did not tell King. Roosevelt asked Nimitz what he recommended. Nimitz recommended the Philippines. He recommended MacArthur's plan over King's plan, over the plan of his own boss. Roosevelt agreed. The Philippines were invaded on the 20th of October, 1944. Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte through knee-deep surf in front of a camera and said the words he had been saving for 2 years and 7 months. I have returned. Admiral King, when he learned that Nimitz had switched sides in that villa on Waikiki, was furious. He never forgave Nimitz. Their working relationship, which had been strained through the middle years of the war, never fully recovered. Chester Nimitz did not care about King's forgiveness. He cared about the Filipinos. He cared about the promise. He cared about the war. The sixth decision came at Leyte Gulf, in the middle of the largest naval battle in the history of the world. On the night of the 24th of October, 1944, Admiral William Halsey Bull Halsey took the Third Fleet north to chase a Japanese carrier decoy force under Vice Admiral Ozawa. The Japanese carriers had no aircraft left. They were bait. They were designed to draw Halsey away from the invasion beaches at Leyte so that a Japanese battleship force under Vice Admiral Kurita could break through the San Bernardino Strait and destroy the American landing. Halsey took the bait. He left the strait unguarded. The next morning, the 25th of October, Kurita's battleship force, including the 70,000-ton super battleship Yamato and 3 other battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, came through the strait and fell on a small American force off the coast of Samar. 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. The battle off Samar was, by any measure of naval combat, the most one-sided fight of the Pacific War. The Americans should have been annihilated. They fought anyway. The destroyer USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee, the first Native American officer to receive the Medal of Honor for naval action, turned into the Japanese fleet and attacked the Yamato with 5-inch guns. He was killed. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts fought until she was sunk. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay was sunk by 15-inch shells. 1,130 Americans died in about 2.5 hours. Then, inexplicably, Vice Admiral Kurita, with an open path to the Leyte invasion beaches, with the American fleet in pieces in front of him, turned his battleships around and went home. He never gave a clear reason. Some historians say he thought he was walking into a trap. Some say he had lost his nerve. Some say he had lost too many cruisers earlier in the battle and did not think he had enough left. Kurita himself, when he was asked years later, gave several different answers. He turned around. He went home. The invasion beaches were saved by the courage of a few hundred American sailors on a handful of tin cans and jeep carriers, and by a Japanese admiral who lost his nerve. Bull Halsey came back from his carrier chase and found the disaster. Washington was furious. Admiral King demanded that Halsey be relieved of his command. Chester Nimitz, sitting in his office at Pearl Harbor, read the messages coming in from every direction. Read King's demand. Read the survivor reports from off Samar. Read the operational summaries. Read Halsey's own report, in which Halsey defended his decision. Nimitz thought about it for one night. Then he sent a message to Washington. He said, "I will not relieve Halsey." He said, "Halsey is a fighting admiral." He said, "We do not fire fighting admirals." King's response is not on the record. Halsey kept his command through the end of the war. He signed the surrender document on the 2nd of September, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri, standing beside Chester Nimitz. The decision was, and remains, controversial. Some historians say Nimitz was right to protect Halsey, that Halsey had made a judgment call under uncertainty, that no admiral should be fired for one such call. Some say Halsey should have been relieved. Both sides have arguments. Both sides have evidence. Chester Nimitz never wrote about it. He never explained. He never publicly defended his choice. He simply made it in one night, alone in his office at Pearl Harbor, in the middle of the largest naval battle in the history of the world. Moved on. Harp 3. By the spring of 1945, Chester Nimitz had commanded the Pacific Fleet for 3 years and 4 months. The islands were falling. The Marianas were American. Iwo Jima was American at a cost of 26,000 American casualties in 36 days of fighting on 8 square miles of black volcanic sand. Nearly 7,000 of those men were dead. 19,000 were wounded. Nimitz had authorized that assault to secure a landing field for damaged B-29 on the way home from Tokyo. The math had made sense on paper. An emergency airfield 700 miles from the enemy's capital would save the lives of thousands of American aircrew. The math did not console him. At a memorial service on Iwo Jima in March of 1945, standing in the black sand under a sky the color of pewter, in front of rows of white grave markers stretching back toward the sea, Chester Nimitz spoke 6 words that Marines still repeat to each other today. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. He said them quietly. He said them once. He did not repeat them. On the 1st of April, 1945, the assault on Okinawa began. 82 days of fighting, 12,520 Americans killed, 36,000 wounded, more than 100,000 Japanese dead, more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead, many of them killed by American shells and bombs, many by Japanese soldiers who ordered them to commit suicide rather than surrender, many by their own hand. 36 American ships sunk by kamikaze aircraft, 368 American ships damaged. The United States Navy suffered more casualties at Okinawa than in any other operation of the Second World War. Nimitz went there. He stood on the flag bridge of Admiral Raymond Spruance's flagship in Buckner Bay and watched Corsairs and Hellcats climb into the sky to intercept incoming kamikazes. He watched a young sailor die on the deck of the destroyer 300 yards away, hit by 20-millimeter fragments. He watched a body pass in the water. He wrote a letter home to Catherine that night. He wrote, "This place is terrible." Did not say more. He never said more. In August of 1945, the atomic bombs came. Hiroshima on the 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th. Nimitz was not consulted. He was not asked whether they should be used. He learned about them, like most of his subordinates, from the radio. Years later, in 1946, after the war was over, Chester Nimitz would write a private memorandum inside the Navy Department that recommended the elimination of atomic weapons. He never made that memorandum public in his lifetime. He never publicly endorsed the atomic bomb. He never publicly opposed it either. His silence on the subject, which was total, was noticed by other admirals of his generation. Nimitz did not talk about the bomb. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. The formal surrender took place on the 2nd of September, 1945. Deck of the USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay, 9 o'clock in the morning. Chester Nimitz was 60 years old. He wore a khaki service uniform, 5 stars on his collar, a rank the United States Navy had created for him 9 months earlier. Fleet Admiral. The Japanese delegation came aboard. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, 65 years old, one-legged from an assassination attempt in 1932, walked on a wooden leg across the teak deck of the Missouri to the table where the surrender documents lay, signed for the Empire of Japan. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed for the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. General Douglas MacArthur signed for the Allied Powers. Chester Nimitz signed for the United States. He used 5 pens because officers on his staff had asked, and because Nimitz was that kind of man's small courtesies for small men, so that the pens could be given away. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He looked at the sky over Tokyo Bay. The bay was full of American warships, more than 250 of them, from cruisers to destroyers to landing craft. And in the distance, a formation of thousands of American aircraft, B-29s, and F-6Fs and TBMs passing overhead in a great arc. War was over. 92,000 American servicemen had died in the Pacific under his command. He knew every number. He had signed every casualty summary. Carry those numbers with him, alone, in silence, for the rest of his life. He said one thing when it was his turn to speak. He said, "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." Then he stepped away from the microphone. He did not speak again in public that day. He served 2 more years. On the 15th of December, 1945, Chester Nimitz became the Chief of Naval Operations, replacing Admiral Ernest King, who retired. For 2 years, he presided over the demobilization of the greatest navy the world had ever known. He fought quietly in memos, in closed committee rooms to protect the independence of the Marine Corps and naval aviation during the unification of the armed services. He won some fights. He lost others. On the 15th of December, 1947, at the age of 62, after 46 years in uniform, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz retired from active service. He and Catherine moved to Berkeley, California. He was offered corporate board seats. He turned them down. He was offered a memoir contract by Life magazine in 1948. He turned it down. He was offered a book deal by Simon & Schuster in 1955. He turned it down. He was asked again and again over 20 years to write his story. He would not. The reason he gave to friends who asked and to E.B. Potter, who would eventually write the authorized biography after his death, was always the same. If I write a memoir, he said, I would have to write about people I knew. He meant King. He meant MacArthur. He meant Halsey. He meant the Redman brothers. He meant Kimmel, whose command he had inherited, whose name would never be cleared in Kimmel's lifetime. He meant 100 lesser men who had made mistakes, or been treated badly, or died young. He did not want to write about them, so he did not write about them. He served as a regent of the University of California from 1948 to 1956. He served briefly as United Nations plebiscite commissioner for the Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan. He could not solve it. Nobody could. He went home. He tended a small garden. He watched his 4 children, Catherine, Chester Jr., Nancy, and Mary, grow into middle age. Kept his silence. Joseph Rochefort died on the 20th of July, 1976, in Torrance, California, at the age of 76. His obituary in the local paper was 3 paragraphs long. The 3 paragraphs did not mention Midway, because Midway was still, in ways, classified, and because Rochefort had spent 34 years of post-war life refusing to be interviewed. He died without a Navy Cross. He died without any national award for what he had done in a basement at Pearl Harbor in May of 1942. 9 years later, on the 30th of May, 1985, President Ronald Reagan held a small ceremony in the East Room of the White House. Joseph Rochefort's son, Joseph Rochefort Jr., then a middle-aged man, accepted, on behalf of his father, the Navy Cross that Chester Nimitz had recommended in 1942 and that the Redman brothers had blocked. 43 years after Midway, 9 years after Joseph Rochefort had died, the citation, read aloud by an aide, described Rochefort's leadership of Station Hypo and his decisive contribution to the American victory at the Battle of Midway. Joseph Rochefort Jr. stood at the front of the room. He held the Navy Cross in a small velvet case. He looked, an observer said later, like a man who had waited his whole life for someone to say the words. 15 years after that, in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded Joseph Rochefort, still posthumously, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States of America. 43 years, and then 58 years to correct one bureaucratic injustice. Chester Nimitz did not live to see either award. He had a stroke in late 1965. He was hospitalized on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay at the Naval Station Hospital there. It was a quiet Navy installation on a small island between San Francisco and Oakland, connected by the Bay Bridge, mostly empty of ships by then. His wife, Catherine, was with him. He had been married to her for 52 years. Developed pneumonia. On the 20th of February, 1966, 4 days before his 81st birthday, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz died. He was 80 years old. He was buried on the 24th of February, what would have been his 81st birthday, at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. His grave is in Section OS. Small stone, standard military marker, rank and name and dates. His close friends had made a request years earlier. They had told him that when their time came, they wanted to be buried near him. Not with him, near him. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who had commanded the amphibious forces at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima, had died on the 12th of February, 1961, 5 years before Nimitz. He was buried at Golden Gate. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had commanded the submarine force in the Pacific from 1943 onward, whose boats had sunk 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost in the war. He died on the 7th of June, 1967, 1 year and 4 months after Nimitz. He is buried at Golden Gate. Fleet Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded Task Force 16 at Midway, who had commanded the 5th Fleet at the Philippine Sea and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, who had turned down offers of higher command after the war and taught quietly at the Naval War College and served as ambassador to the Philippines. He died on the 13th of December, 1969. He is buried at Golden Gate, 4 Pacific commanders, in a row, beside their friend. There has never been anything else quite like it in the history of the United States military. 4 4-star and 3-star officers, the commanders of the Pacific Fleet, the submarine force, the amphibious force, and the fast carrier force buried side by side by their own request in a small cemetery in a small town south of San Francisco in a line so short you can see all 4 graves at once. Catherine Freeman Nimitz lived 13 more years after her husband died. She was buried beside him on the 12th of February, 1979. She was 90 years old, 52 years married, 13 years widowed. She lies now under a stone identical to his. If you go to Golden Gate National Cemetery today, you can. It is open. There is no ticket, no gate, no fee, and walk into Section OS, past the older graves, past the World War I markers, past the flags on the little brass staffs. You will come, eventually, a short row of stones. Turner, Lockwood, Spruance, Nimitz, Catherine. The wind off the bay comes across those graves. It is cold most of the year, even in California. The stones are simple. There are no equestrian statues, no obelisks, no monuments. Chester Nimitz asked for nothing more. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. He did not sit for oral histories. He did not defend his decisions when they were criticized. He did not attack Admiral King. He did not undermine MacArthur. He did not repudiate Halsey. He did not go back and try to fix Joseph Rochefort's record because he knew Washington still could not admit that Rochefort had been right. And Nimitz had lived his whole life understanding that Washington's memory, once wounded, was cruel. He waited. He believed history would come for the truth eventually. He was right. It did. Just not while he was there to see it. In Fredericksburg, Texas, in the town where he was born, above the old Steamboat Hotel that his grandfather, Charles Henry Nimitz, had run, that tavern is still there. It is a museum now, the National Museum of the Pacific War. Any American can walk into it. Any veteran can walk into it. Any grandson of any sailor can walk into it on any day of the year and see the exhibits about Midway, about Guadalcanal, about Leyte Gulf, about Iwo Jima, about the surrender on the USS Missouri. There is a portrait of Chester W. Nimitz on the wall. He is 56 years old in the portrait. He is wearing khakis. He has no ribbons. He is standing on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling at Pearl Harbor on the 31st of December, 1941. Behind him, you can see, in the distance, the smoke still rising from the wrecks of the Pacific Fleet. He looks calm. He is looking straight into the camera. He has 45 months and 6 decisions in front of him. Decisions that Washington did not want him to make. He's about to make every one of them. He's about to win the war. Then he is going home to Berkeley to plant a garden and to say nothing, and to be buried at the age of 80 in a small cemetery beside 3 friends and a wife. That was Chester Nimitz. He did not write his story. He lived it, and then he let it go. The ones who did not come home are the reason the rest of us did. And a boy who was born above a tavern in Fredericksburg, Texas, in 1885, who was court-martialed at 23, who was passed over 28 admirals in 1941, is the reason the Pacific War ended when it did. He never took credit. He never told the story. He only signed the surrender document on the deck of the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September, 1945, and went home.